We're going to move, and since we're talking about D's, we have David and disruption. This is a Sesame Street episode here. I want to now bring into today's sessions David Skok, who's joining us from Toronto, and David is the editor in chief and founder of The Logic, which I'll let David explain here. But I will also set you up a little bit, David, to say, from what I understand, you've worked all the platforms before starting this news organization. I'd love for you to actually, if we could begin with the granular and you tell us a little bit about the logic, and then we'll go to the grand from there before we go back to the logic as the model that we can learn from. So welcome, and please tell us about what you're up to with the logic.
Sure. Thank you, Graham. And I hope you can all hear me okay. Wonderful to follow such a distinguished panel on such an important topic that we certainly are thinking a lot about in our newsroom and around the country of Canada, where I am. So The Logic is a publication that has started in 2018. It really is a business publication focused on Canada's transformation from a resource economy to a knowledge economy. So what we always say is, while other publications look at Canada and where it was 5 years ago, we look at where Canada will be 5 years from now. Think of the Financial Times meets the Information is kind of the intersection of it, because Canada is a different place than the United States. It's a digital subscription-based publication. We charge $300 a year. We're now 2.5 years old, and even in the midst of the pandemic, I'm relieved and excited to say that we're doing just fine.
Now, to get to the broader question, right, with this global audience, how are we doing? How's the news? How would you describe the news ecosystem and the information ecosystem when you look at where we're at in 2020 in this era? Not just the specialized year for all of its woes of 2020, but where we are 20 years into the 21st century.
Graham, it's interesting. I'm and maybe you have to be an entrepreneur, but I am a hopeless optimist. I believe that at the end of the day, things will be fine. It has not been a great year if you look at if you read the headlines, particularly in North America, which I'm most familiar with, but I also know in Europe as well, with advertising really taking that hit. And in not just media, but in all businesses, you're seeing the push to e-commerce or the acceleration of digital as a result of the pandemic has really expedited what was going to take place in 5 years is now taking place and has taken place in 6 months. What that has done is it's just accelerated a lot of the declines that you were already seeing in traditional media. And that's where, of course, and I'm sure others are talking about it, you're seeing some of the policy pronouncements and pushes for Google and Facebook in Europe, in Australia, in Canada now as well, in the United States, to pay their fair share to compensate for that gap. I'm a student of Clayton Christensen. I spent a wonderful year of my life studying with Clay, who really the original theory of disruption. That horrible word was actually an academic theory that was started by Clay. And what's so fascinating about Clay's work, and I realized it when I first studied with him, but it seems even more clear now, is it's so hard day to day to see the forest from the trees and what we do. And what Clay's theories did was they put a wonderful lens upon which to see everything happens over time. So we are in a particular moment in time where right now there is a lot of fragmentation of media, a lot of talk about filter bubbles. We're seeing this particularly in the United States with the Trump presidency and how right-wing outlets have kind of formed on their one side, and you have the New York Times and others on the other side. This is actually, at least the theory would say, this is normal. This is what happens when technology goes up the value chain. It allows disruptors to come in and start to pick away at the core business of the legacy organizations. When you have that fragmentation, it means that there's all these different filters. Here's the good news, and I know it's a long answer to your question, but here's the really good news. When there's fragmentation, what does that mean? There's going to be interdependence again. What does that mean? It means that there will be consolidation again. So what we're living through right now is actually not that different to what we lived through in the early 1900s, where you had hundreds of pamphlets and newspapers in cities. Well, then you had the William Randolph Hearsts of the world. You had the Rupert Murdochs of the world later, or the Conrad Blacks and Hollinger, who started acquiring all these publications and shrinking it together. So I think what we're starting to see is that consolidation, particularly in the digital media space, with Huffington Post and BuzzFeed coming together. But you're going to see a lot more of that. And my hope is that as that consolidation happens, you will see a new media ecosystem that is more of a mass media that we're more used to, and less of this fragmentation across the board. So the short answer is we're in a moment in time, and in my view, I think that that moment will evolve like it all does, like it always does, and we'll see more concentration again in media, which isn't necessarily, I know concentration in media sounds like a bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing.
Well, it might be nice for us to get at how could we do it better than happened 100 years ago, right? Lessons learned from history. I do like the way that you are looking to the past to look to the future. And so I'm curious about lessons learned there. I do, I think, we have a faceless audience here, but I know that people are in a lot of different markets. I wonder if there's a quick catch me up on what disruption theory is. I know there's no short answer to that, but disruption, you've kind of just drawn a link between disruption theory and the media, but maybe there is kind of a quicker way to say, here's disruption theory, and the media is not an easy one for disruption theory to play out, for the lay mind. But I like how you're drawing the links, taking something from, that we're applying to the tech sphere and making it directly apply to media. But is there a way to catch people up on disruption theory here for those who haven't spent?
I'll do my best to do it very quickly. And I should also say, sometimes in media, we like to think we're exceptional. And while I, having done this for 20 years, I'd like to think I'm exceptional. But media is another marketplace like everything else. And I think sometimes our own romance about what we do gets in the way of the fundamentals, which are similar to other industries. So disruption theory at its purest form is essentially that the pursuit of profits is what makes a firm vulnerable to being eaten alive and destroyed. So you have a CEO or a manager whose entire job is predicated on increasing their profit margin. In journalism, you want to increase your profit margin, obviously, because then you can invest more in reporters, as you grow. But ultimately, that pursuit of profits means you have to work your way up the value chain and do things that are more expensive. And so as you move up the chain and you spend more, you start to see disruptors come in at the bottom of the market. I'm using my hands and you can't really see them because I'm not in front of the camera. But so as I'm moving up the value chain here, you start to have people come in at the bottom of the market who start to pick away and say, you know what? We don't need a margin like these guys have up here. We can pick away at this classified business at a 5% margin while they're looking at a 40% margin. They'll never notice us because they're not looking at that. Their job is to look at the high margin business. And so because this is the crazy thing about disruption, because the CEO and the senior management team are doing exactly what they're supposed to do by pursuing greater and greater margins of profit, they make themselves vulnerable at the bottom of the market for new entrants to come in and pick them off one vertical at a time. And that is what is happening in media when you think of classifieds being a classic one, but then also the sports section. We have The Athletic now, which is picking apart at that, but also ESPN did that for a long time too. Even here in small towns, you see, flyers for advertisements. Well, hyper local advertisements can pick away at that business that traditional newspapers have had. So that's my attempt at explaining disruption theory in a short period of time.
No, that's great. I think there's certainly resources for people online on this, and it's worth looking at. It's a really constructive exercise to sort of think about where your business is vulnerable, and so I appreciate that. Can you talk briefly about the job to be done theory and how that plays into it works against us when we're trying to respond to the world as is with potentially outdated hierarchies and structures of newsrooms?
Well, so yeah, that's less the job to be done theory, more the RPP model, which is the resource processes and priorities. But I'll just quickly, job to be done theory is actually another heartwarming thing that gives me optimism about the future of journalism. The short definition of job to be done is the same job that we tried to fulfill centuries ago is the job that we're fulfilling today in the work that we're doing. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you were a caveman or a cave woman or in a cave uh, centuries ago or millennia ago, depending on what you think, you would have had to have been informed about what was happening over the mountain on the other side of that. The same job. So you had at that time, maybe you had a bird on your shoulder that would go and see, canary would see what was happening outside. But you had someone or something inform you of what was happening over that hill. Why did you do that? Because you needed to protect your family and make sure that you could feed your family. Um, if you think about the fundamental tenets of journalism, that hasn't changed. And you saw this in the pandemic with the massive increase in traffic and audience that went to newspapers and to news organizations during the height of the pandemic. People wanted to know how to keep their families safe. And so they turned to journalism. So what is the job to be done? The job is, how do I inform, at least in my view, one of the jobs is how do I inform my family in order to keep them safe? There's many other jobs, but that's a good example of one. It's timeless. It doesn't matter whether you were doing it today or you were doing it centuries ago. It's the same job. And if you have that, then you recognize that, okay, if that's the job, can my organization do it in a way that is cheaper, faster, and good enough for the consumer or for the reader or for the audience? And if you can say cheaper, faster, good enough, and check off all three, then you have a disruptive business model on your competitors. Because while they think that the job to be done is this expensive, burdensome cost structure thing, like, delivering a newspaper from printing press to a door, and I can just do it in an email, well, that's cheaper, faster, and good enough. That is disruptive. So technology allows you to make things cheaper and faster and good enough in the job to be done. In terms of the RPP model and leadership, uh, culture, the idea of culture, and this came up in the previous panel. What is culture? When we talk about changing newsrooms, what do we actually mean by that? It's not an ephemeral thing, culture. We sometimes like to think it's something you can just feel, oh, it must be the culture. No, culture, as it's defined in Clay's work, is all the resources that you have invested in a business and that you have given people to work with. It's all the processes, so the things that they do day to day, moving this widget from here to there. And it's the priorities of the organization. What do we incentivize as being important? Uh, However you incentivize, and by the way, also disincentivize by not mentioning, that sets a tone and tenor that trickles through the entire organization. That's obvious, right? Leader stands up and says, we want to be the best newspaper in the world. Okay, well, now that becomes the organizational culture. We want to be diverse. Okay, great. But it's not good enough to just do that. You have to think about, on the process side, uh, how's my day-to-day job actually going to change? What are the tasks when I log onto my computer every day? How is the task for moving that widget from A to B going to change? If you don't change that, good luck changing a culture. And then finally, the resources. Well, okay, have I provided someone with the tools they need to equip them to do the job that I'm now asking them to do? If you cannot provide the resources, the processes, and the priorities in alignment to change the culture, you cannot change an organization. And so, at least when I think about it, it's not good enough to just send an email saying we're going to be a more diverse organization. We have to do the hard work and think about how do we change the processes and how do we provide the resources for people to in order to do that.
Let me pause to just let people know we'd love to have questions in the Q&A window. But David, if it's okay with you, I'd also say to people, because there's a lot of fear in newsrooms, right? There's a lot of fear throughout news organizations. If you don't have any questions, we'd also welcome you to share what are your fears when you hear about disruption theory and change. what's happening? I'm speaking to the audience now, not to you, Dave. But
I have fears too. Don't worry.
yeah, what are you seeing in your places of work, in your newsrooms that are paralyzing at this moment, that are preventing this sort of change? And also, even what are you skeptical about when you hear things like disruption theory, which and recognize that you need to change your mindset, um, but also recognize how hard it is. And while we're waiting for those responses, David, I'd actually love to hear a little bit more about the logic as an example, like what your bet is, and other examples. The model that people often point to, the Harvard Business Reviews often point to, for disruption in media, are Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. And we've seen the consolidation happening with the acquisition of Huffington Post, happening this fall. But are those the right models for us to look at? Are there other models you would say we should look at, in trying to figure out what's working and from whom we could learn? Again, don't be too humble. Like, what are you learning? That the logic is really useful for us, but what are you learning from other places?
Well, it's not going to be humble. It's going to be more political in saying that I don't think there's one size fits all model. It really is dependent on what kind of work you're doing, what kind of audience you're trying to reach, and what kind of product you're putting out, in terms of the actual technology that you're using. All of those things, whether it's the editorial strategy, the business strategy, or the product strategy, dictate what kind of model you need to have. So, let's look at Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. Both organizations were essentially captured successful business models as a moment in time with the technologies that were available to them. Huffington Post was the first real news organization out there to game search and really identify and figure out how you could use search engines to deliver audience to your product. The classic example being the "What time is the Super Bowl?" Question that you would Google. You put in a search engine, and there would be an article to the Huffington Post. You click on it, and all the article to the Huffington Post would say is kickoff is at 6:37 p.m. That's how they had 4 or 5 display ads around that article. So they figured out how to align their editorial strategy with with the technology that was around at that time. But they couldn't adapt to the next world, which was social. And BuzzFeed, funnily enough, was great at figuring out how to use social as a technology and a platform to do their journalism, right? Which was the clickbait, listicles, 10 things you need to know about X. So for me, it's less about, okay, can I optimize in this moment with this platform? And it's more about, how do I build an organization that has in its DNA the agility and the adaptability to know that the technology will change, and how do we change with the technology? That's where I come back to the culture piece of the art, the resources, the priorities, and the processes, where I care less about what's the business model to anybody who's listening, and say, figure out what your culture is, because that will then help you find the next business models when they come. And I will just say, I live in fear. The Andy Grove Intel example of Only the Paranoid Survive, which is a great book if you haven't read it. I live in fear of that. What is the next model? We rely heavily on subscriptions, but already you can see the newsletter business is starting to cut away or chip away at the access to a website paywall technology business. So how do we as a business adapt and make sure that we are looking down market to see what else is out there that we need to pivot to in order to stay alive? So I didn't answer your question deliberately, in that it's about thinking about what's next and how you can make your organization have that in its DNA. That's more important than whether it's pivot to video, pivot to podcast, pivot to newsletters, or whatever else the new fancy tools of the day are.
Great. We do have a couple of questions, David. So the first one I want to share is from Martinell, the columnist, and he's with the Czech Economic Daily. And he's curious about paywalls. And so he said, I would like to know more about how is it to build niche media and persuade people to pay for that? At his publication, they struggle with the paywall model a bit, and the usual reply is, quote, I can find everything on the internet for free. So his direct question is, what would you consider like three most important points on that? You don't have to be wedded to three. Their legacy media example and struggling to transform into a digital one.
Well, I think that last point is the key there. Being a legacy media company means that you already have a culture and a newsroom and incentives that are all designed for that legacy media business. And if you're going to have a paywall, it's not good enough to just put a paywall on top of the same journalism you were doing. You have to shift your entire editorial strategy in order to reflect the paywall model. So sometimes if you want to keep the ad revenue, which I understand, you want to keep the impressions, that's hard to do. You're better off splitting out into a separate sub vertical that is the niche media product. Three things I don't know, but main thing is fundamentally to that point of I can get this anywhere else. Well, no, you can't. Is your reporting and your product, are you confident enough in your product that you cannot get it anywhere else? The number one question we ask in our newsroom every day is, if we were to go away tomorrow, would the country miss us? Are we doing something that is indispensable, that is 10 times better than what everybody else is doing, so that we are indispensable? And so the argument of, well, I can just pay to get that somewhere else. Well, the answer is you could pay to get you could get it for free, a cheap aggregated version of what we do. But hey, nobody else broke the MindGeek Pornhub story in Canada before the New York Times, except for The Logic. Nobody else broke the story of Palantir, having AIDS in the Prime Minister's office, except for The Logic. So no, you cannot get that anywhere else. And so that is the main number one thing: is the editorial has to be of a quality that refutes that argument immediately. Then again, making sure that you have alignment on the business side, the strategy side, the business side, the product side, and the editorial side, because you could have a great piece of journalism, but if it doesn't load on my phone in 0.0001 seconds and result in 500 pop-up ads on my site, I'm not paying for it. So you have to think, okay, if this is a premium product, it's got to, the Steve Jobs thing, right? It's got to feel premium. And so that would be my two, I guess. I didn't give you three, but I gave you two.
Always leave them wanting a little bit more, David. There's a question from Jeremy that I may edit a little bit because it veers to one of the questions I wanted to ask, but Jeremy's with Transitions Online. He's talking about not being afraid of consolidation. And the question he has is, do you feel that the incredible richness of voices that we now have, which may or may not be sustainable, will diminish with larger companies acquiring these smaller startups? Or do you anticipate that such acquisitions will diversify the larger, more powerful media companies? And I think this is really one of these kind of, how do we learn from history, in both in terms of, hey, don't panic, we've been here before, and here are some of the things that are likely to come, while also recognizing the limitations, right? So if we think back to this sort of the very short golden era of media in North America, which is almost an exceptional period rather than the norm, thinking about the early 70s in particular, it was still quite narrow in terms of the voices, who was invited to the table. It was consolidated and it was efficient, but it wasn't opening and welcoming of all of the voices, and it didn't connect with the way most people lived in this part of the world. The story is a little bit different across different regions, but there are enough similarities. So what are your worries with that? And more importantly, how do we actually avoid that construct?
Well, so let's assume we're at that point then where there's full media consolidation again, and now you have a couple of players. Remember, disruption theory means that they are in pursuit of profits, and so they're marching up the value chain as well. So as they march up the value chain, guess what happens? you're going to have people at the bottom of the value chain start to pick apart at their business. So the disruptors today will become the disrupted tomorrow. And that's, I think, the key is, it's, in my view, when I look and think about business through the lens of disruption theory, which is how I've essentially, applied it to my whole career. It's an ongoing cycle where those today at the bottom of the market become the top of the market, then others come in at the bottom. And so you're always living through a snapshot in time. You're not living through the end days. And so, yeah, are there ways that we could try to buttress that? I think maybe you could have some regulatory approaches to that. I don't know. I would imagine it would get more narrowcast, but in narrowcasting, that would also create new opportunities for others. Again, that's probably not the most satisfying answer, and I appreciate that it's not in terms of what it means to democratic discourse. But this is the truly business lens being applied to what is a fundamental democratic ideal.
David, I think you've given us some really important tools to think about where we're at in our world right now in the media, and this conference does attract a lot of change agents. And I think in 2020, we in our field, we have to view 2020 as a challenge to us to recognize what people really need. The notes that I just sort of underlined a million times from you are be indispensable, and also think at your core, what is it that we're doing for civic society? And this is a year for us all to look at the structures. And if you're not recognizing in 2020 that the way that was is not the way that will be, I don't know when you would recognize that. So thanks for the tools here, and thanks for your work. We'll pay attention to the logic, but much appreciated.
Well, you're most welcome. Thank you for having me, and I'm terribly sorry I couldn't be there in person. Prague is a beautiful place, and I'm envious of those of you that are watching this from home.
All right, thank you, David.